Press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from News Laundry.
Hello and welcome to News Laundry's digital policy series with the dialogue on intermediary liabilities. If you want to understand what intermediary liabilities is, you need to watch Meghnad's explainer before you watch this episode, and then you have to watch the second episode where Abhinandan talks about content moderation. In this episode, we're going to be talking about something that's really close to my heart and something that I have been thinking for a while, which is hate speech and fake news. And we have an excellent panel with us that's going to help me navigate through some of the questions I have, and hopefully will answer some of the questions you guys may have on this issue. I'll just introduce our panel quickly. We have with us Rishab Bailey, who's legal consultant at the National Institute of Public Finance Policy. We have with us Sarvjeet Singh, who's Executive Director of Center for Communication Governance in National Law University, Delhi. And we have with us Udbhav Tiwari, who's Public Policy Advisor at Mozilla. So, great panel with us, and I'm going to jump right in. First disclosure, all of our panels here are going to be, whatever they say is reflective of their own views. It's not necessarily reflective of the organization's view, so you need to keep that in mind. And just to begin with, I think from what I understand, India doesn't really have very specific hate speech laws. This is my understanding for now. We do have laws in the IPC that can take you to task for spreading religious enmity or promoting religious enmity or causing disaffection in society and stuff like that. But say unlike the US or the West, where there's a definition of what hate speech is, we don't really have that here. And so so our laws are it's not really clear what hate speech is, what isn't. So I just want to begin with you guys, first asking you whether you think there's a need for another law which explains what hate speech is, defines it, and then comes out with how to deal with it, or do you think we have enough laws? Why don't you go ahead?
Well, as you pointed out, we do have a number of laws that already deal with a lot of the issues that we are seeing in the online space, whether it's harassment, trolling. We've even had cases of, say, revenge porn being dealt with under current laws, so on and so forth. So we don't have a catch-all hate speech category in the law. However, the courts have interpreted many of the existing laws to also apply them to the internet. And so you could argue that many of the sort of offenses or harms that you see in the online context can be captured under current laws. Of course, if you do see that there's a particular problem at hand which is not being addressed by the current laws, and there is a need for a more targeted and specific legislation that could help address some of these problems, yes, that isn't a problem. However, the problem might occur is if you try and bring in a law that is trying to capture either too much content or is very broad or ambiguous in its scope. We've already seen, for instance, what happened in the context of Section 66A, which you could broadly call a hate speech related law, though it had a huge variety of information that could be prescribed under the law. And then the Supreme Court in the Shreya Singhal case in 2016 did specifically talk about how criminal law in particular needs to be very specific and targeted. So you can't have arbitrary or vague definitions of what these categories of content that you shouldn't have are. So I would say as long as it's a very specific law that is brought in place to address a specific need, that's fine. But having a category broadly called hate speech, which allows anything that either the state or a person considers offensive as being something that should be taken off the internet, I think would be a dangerous step to take.
Where do you come in, Udbhav? I just wanted to also ask you that, so hate speech can be defined as maybe targeting a person racially or based on their gender, sex, sexual orientation and stuff like that, which is not necessarily always criminalized, right? When hate speech is criminalized is when it leads to direct sort of call to violence or real life sort of consequences. So that distinction needs to be made. But I want to understand from you also that do you think that we need a law that deals with that, hate speech, and whether it should be criminalized or not, or do you think we have enough laws and we need to just sort of implement those better?
No, I mean, I think that there's more than enough clarity in India for what most hate speech looks like and why it's problematic. I mean, there are two aspects to look at it. Like the first is the laws and the legislation itself. And then, like Rishab mentioned, the courts have actually over the last 70 years gone into a fair amount of detail, and some even before independence, as to what different aspects of hate speech would look like. So on a day-to-day basis, I think one firstly needs to understand that necessarily like making something criminal does not mean that hate speech will not take place, because at the end of the day, when you make something a crime, it has a deterrent effect. But not everyone really expresses hate speech in a manner that they think about whether they would necessarily go to jail for it. And I think we all recognize that the threshold for when content may or may not be taken down from the internet is probably lower than the person who's saying it should go to prison for it. Right? So
can you give me an example?
For example, like if you look at community standards on platforms like Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube, like the standards that are present in those community standards are often much lower than what is required to send someone to prison for a certain act or a comment.
Okay.
So you may put a YouTube video up that will violate normal societal sensibility that YouTube would decide to take down, but may not necessarily send you to prison if it were to taken before a court of law, because in criminal law there is a higher threshold for the harm that should occur to society.
Exactly.
But platforms have been given the leeway to decide that we don't think that we want such content on our platforms, and therefore take it down. So I don't think criminalization is the only aspect in which conversations around hate speech should take place, but it's important for us to also talk about the various thresholds below that in order to make sure that we're actually tackling the problem.
So I think one of the major things that we need, at least from the intermediaries, and there's still a question of whether you want to hold them as public authorities, but I think even if you don't want to go that far, I think there's a lot more need of transparency and accountability on the side of these intermediaries. Coming to the first point of, I think, whether we need a specific law, I think both what Rishab and Udbhav said, I think there is enough research out there, enough court cases that say, I think that we have more than enough laws to tackle all different kinds of hate speech that we have. I think one of the problems has been implementation, and the second is just the capacity. So I think a lot of our laws, if we read just the language, seems that they will curb speech and stuff, but the courts, and especially the Supreme Court, I think over the years, as Udbhav mentioned, over the past 70 years, has limited those. But I think the problem then is the capacity of implementation, of can you implement it on only very, very targeted ways. And the question of defining hate speech, I think that is a slippery slope, and I think that's generally recognized. Like under international law also across instruments, I think there is no definition of hate speech. And even at UN level, I think a lot of times it has been tried. I think the general consensus has been that you should not define hate speech, because either it'll be overbroad and will cover a lot of speech that should be protected, as happened with 66A, or it will always be under-inclusive, and a lot of stuff that is actually hate speech or that affects a lot of minorities and other groups will remain out of it. So I think, as both my colleagues said, I think what we need to do is make sure that the current laws are implemented properly and think of solutions outside of only criminal law.
Okay.
Just to actually add to that, I mean, I think if you go through any of the terms and conditions of the major platforms, and I won't call them just intermediaries, because intermediaries is everyone along that chain, they have really, really broad terms and conditions. So they cover pretty much anything that you would consider harmful, even if it might not actually be so. So Sarvjeet is absolutely right. It's a question of uniformity, consistency, and transparency in the application of these of their own terms of service, essentially. A second aspect I would sort of like to highlight when you're talking about a new law is that we don't necessarily, I think as both Sarvjeet and Udbhav have highlighted, we don't necessarily need a new law to deal with hate speech itself, but there are a number of other new harms and offenses that are increasingly being realized in the context of the internet, many of which can also be propagated by the platforms themselves. So, you know, whether you're talking about manipulation by platforms, whether you're talking about how certain platforms might drive particular types of content in order to increase engagement, those are other issues that we might actually have to look at further. But just hate speech itself, I do think we have a significant amount of jurisprudence in India that covers this.
Okay. So I think the central question that I want to address here with all of you, and I think a lot of people, this is a debate that's happening a lot among journalists also, that platforms like Facebook or Twitter are not doing enough, or that WhatsApp is not doing enough, and that they can do much, but there's not enough to control hate speech. And I just want to use some real life examples to get your views on this debate. But I just want to come in here with what the Information Technology Intermediary Liability Guidelines of 2018 say is that they mandate breaking encryption and automatic takedown of content without checks and balances. That's a bit scary for me, because if you're automatically taking stuff down out, and hate speech is such a thing that I think there has to be some level of human intervention, because so many things are culture specific and so many things are contextual. And if you have just random taking down, it's quite problematic. But I'm just going to throw an example at you, and I just want you guys to tell me, like, how would you want, in a best case scenario, how would you want that intermediary to deal with the problem at hand? So we're recording at a time where things in JNU have really blown up and it's all over the news, and now there's news doing the rounds that WhatsApp was used to organize the attack. And this is all in the realm of investigation right now. We really don't know who did what, but preliminary reports suggest that WhatsApp was used to sort of organize violence. In such a situation, what are the sort of responsibilities that you think WhatsApp should have? Where do you think, so one, that, and how much should government intervene to sort of check on this with the help of WhatsApp?
I would hesitate to say that WhatsApp should be able to scrutinize all your messages and try and determine if something bad is going to happen in any part of the country and therefore inform the police about it and so on. I think will be a significant infringement on privacy rights, and I'm not sure it would fall within the framework laid down by the Supreme Court in Puttaswamy. I think it might be seen as disproportionate or excessive. Also, I'm not sure it might be an entirely suitable measure. I mean, we have always found ways of communicating, even under duress. I mean, I think we all learned when we were in school about how during the freedom struggle, for instance, chapatis were distributed and so on in order to plan protests. So there will always be ways in which you can get around these sort of centralized control systems. So just targeting WhatsApp itself is not going to help. Tomorrow you're going to move to another service anyway, or you'll find another way of doing it which is more distributed and therefore becomes difficult for the government to actually try and deal with. What I would say is that, as with most cases of censorship, it generally becomes about an arms race. The government is going to try and have to increase its capacity to decrypt, to, take action on its own. Equally, there is a role that the government has to play in terms of educating people about how to use these tools, about being less violent, so on and so forth, so starting off from your schools and so on and so forth. But I would really hesitate to say that there should be a mandate in the law for WhatsApp to completely remove encryption or any such. Also, let's not forget that the bigger problem with the draft rules that you mentioned in 2018 is not so much just the fact that they mandate traceability and all these and assistance to be given. The point is the law already has ways in which the government or the law enforcement authorities can access information held by platforms. They can trace people, they can monitor what people are up to on the internet. But however, those provisions under Section 69A, for instance, of the IT Act have very specific rules under it which also have procedural guidelines in place. You could argue about whether those guidelines are sufficient or not in and of themselves, but the point is they therefore adhere to Supreme Court dicta which says that when you're infringing rights, in addition to being proportionate, so on and so forth, there must be procedural fetters to stop misuse of these laws. The 2018 guidelines basically then try to short-circuit this process by basically saying, in case we want any assistance or information, you must give it to us. Okay. Why have this provision when you already have this provision under existing laws with procedural checks in place?
So what I get from you is that basically no pre-screening. You can't expect WhatsApp to predetermine maybe an organized sort of a thing and inform the police. So you can't work as spies with your network.
I wouldn't want WhatsApp to work in that way. I think at best you could, or not at best, but I think one possible solution might be to cast procedural obligations on WhatsApp and then or any other platform. Based again on the specific type of harm, the risk that is likely to occur because of any of these particular types of illegal activities on it. And so, for instance, you tell them to put in place a redressal mechanism that users can access really quickly. You try and ensure that complaints are dealt with in a transparent manner really, really fast. But you don't hold them liable for the actual offense that has occurred. You might hold them liable for saying, no, because someone complained and you didn't take any action, or you didn't explain to them why you didn't take any action, so on and so forth. We will hold you to some extent accountable for that. But we're not going to say because someone planned a murder on WhatsApp, we'll hold you responsible for the murder.
True, that's true. And a good way to look at it is maybe is to look at a murder or something else planned on. It's really
so let me give you an example.
When you talk about protests and stuff like that, it becomes a bit political.
So just to give you a sort of off the top of my head example, and it might not be completely accurate, but you go into a mall, which is a quasi-public place. It's a private place, but it's where the public can sort of gather. If I murder someone in a mall, the mall owner is not responsible for the murder in itself. But there are additional regulations that are imposed by the state because of the nature of the place. So they might say, for instance, you need to pat people down and make sure that there are no weapons being carried into the mall. That in itself is not the same as an offense of murder. So you might hold them liable for saying, "Aapne guns क्यों allow किए अपने mall में?" But you will not say आपने murder क्यों allow किया अपने mall में, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for us to understand that content moderation and regulation is really hard, right? I mean, there are about 500 hours of video that I think are uploaded on YouTube every minute. And every single minute.
500 hours every minute.
Right, and this is in pretty much every single language and dialect that can exist on like the internet from all over the world. So in order for us to even make the determinations that we are talking about, no pre-screening, which means people need to report content or it needs to be detected, then a human being needs to review that piece of content, make what is often a very delicate call, right? You can't have someone sitting out of, say, the United States of America making a call on whether a video in Marathi with the Maharashtra agitation is hate speech or not. It requires a lot of context that often...
Cultural context and language,
absolutely,
most important.
Right. And then even within these companies, usually there's an internal process where you either flag it, if you don't, then you can appeal it, and then other people get taken a look and teams from that country get dropped in. So it's a really, really hard thing to do right. And this is just the example of one video. On an average, I think there's YouTube has transparency reports that it puts out for how content is being processed, and I think close to 81 or 87% of the content that they took down for child sexual materials and terrorism was taken down before a single human being saw it.
So that's a great example, actually. So when they do want to act, for example, but maybe that also comes from the fact that there are laws, very strict criminal laws against child porn, right? And we don't have that when it comes to hate speech. Is that one reason why they're just acting fast on something?
I think it has everything to do with how easy it is to technically detect that kind of content.
Okay.
Right?
Actually, there have been a significant number of false positives, if you will. There have been a lot of cases where Twitter, Facebook, so on, have blocked legitimate content thinking that it was illegitimate. A good example might be the very famous photo from the Vietnam War where you had that little girl with napalm burns, right? Her clothes are sort of burnt off and running away. That was taken down by Facebook because they said child porn. Similarly, you've had lots of cases like that, actually, if you want to go down the list.
Right? Yeah, so I mean, and I think that, so the solution is always a mixture of using technology in order to detect content, making sure you have enough human beings that can help review the content in order to triage it, and recognizing that there's always going to be some that should have been taken down that are going to be up, and some that should not have been that should have been taken down that are still on the platform, right? So keeping that context in mind, I think that using the WhatsApp example and using say what if there's organization of violence happening on the platform, I think offline laws would apply equally to something like that. It would be a criminal conspiracy if you're coming together to try to elicit violence. It's something that if we know about it, if it was being so openly discussed, it's clear that there's evidence of that group. There are phone numbers on that group, and the police can very easily find out the information of who those phone numbers belong to and go after them. So I think that it's important for us to not think that the online world is like some lawless place where the police can't do anything at all, but investigative techniques exist in order to solve a lot of these problems without breaking encryption. Because if you look at, I think, a benefits and harm sort of comparison, the benefits that one gets from end-to-end encryption with regard to anonymity, with regard to protection from state surveillance, far outweigh the possibility that people may use the platform in order to organize violence, because that they would do on any other platform.
So what you're saying is the platform will anyway have to comply if there has been a crime in offline and there's enough proof that it was organized on one of the platforms, the platform will have to anyway comply with the investigation.
Exactly. There are more than enough laws
so
for that.
No need to really have a pre-screening or have an additional sort of blanket pulling down of content and stuff like that.
I mean, I also think that end-to-end encryption prevents the content itself from being available to people in between, but there's an incredible amount of metadata. So if I go to WhatsApp and ask them, this is a phone number, this is another phone number, we know that they communicated between this time, can you tell us the metadata around this particular message, which would be the time the message was sent, the IP addresses from which it was sent, and there's a lot of metadata. That metadata is very useful for investigative purposes, and WhatsApp and most other platforms share this information whenever there's a lawful request from law enforcement agencies as well. So I think like it's important for us to understand the process around how crimes are solved online before we try to regulate it in a manner where we presume nothing has changed since 1995 when the internet was apparently this open lawless place, which it wasn't even.
It wasn't. Just to add on to that, if I may, actually, I think it's also important to make the differentiation between the state requiring platforms to take certain action to take content off, and platforms
Doing
acting
it on
their own
yeah.
basis. Because keep in mind that there's also an incentive for platforms themselves to take down content which either is harming their individual users, because presumably the users might not want to use that service anymore, or else to avoid excessive regulation by the government. So, for instance, after the terrorist attacks in New Zealand, where it was live streamed, there have been efforts, I think, by a lot of intermediaries or a lot of platforms to put in place checks, particularly regarding live streaming of terrorist attacks, so on and so forth. So it is important to have that differentiation in mind.
Yeah, you were saying.
No, so I think just based on this, so first, even example, right? If we take a more simple example or a more relevant than even the mall example, in this case, if they weren't using WhatsApp and they were just calling each other on telephones, you won't hold a Airtel or a Reliance Jio liable for this.
Or if they were doing it over an email thread, for example, with everyone in CC, like that doesn't mean that like that thing is criminal.
So I think as both Rishab and Udbhav said, I don't think you, like at the end of the day, WhatsApp is only a messenger. And you can't hold the message. It's not even a messenger, right? It's just a intermediary through which you communicate. You can do that through letters. So if they did it through letters, will you hold Indian Post liable? We won't do that. So I think it's the same thing. One thing I think, yes, all of us should acknowledge probably, and I think is the virality of the content, that the virality here is a lot faster than anything else. And I think that's where probably, I think why all of us have been thinking of how to deal with some of these issues. But yeah, partly that. And then with pre-censorship, as Udbhav said, I think of given the kind of content, given the technology. So if we take just the example of Facebook, I think last year Mark Zuckerberg wrote a big blog post of saying of how successful or not they have been in automatically removing a lot of this content. And I think on stuff like pornography or nudity and stuff, they said it was over 90%, because that is something that's easy for the automated filters to take down, because I think you can show them enough pictures and I think they can learn. But on questions like hate speech, questions of bullying and harassing, that number was very, very low, because as we discussed, I think you need a lot of context. What is hate speech for? As in, if we arbitrarily take it, what is hate speech for me may not be for you. But I think anyways, even for courts and I think generally legally, to decide what is hate speech is so problematic, because one, you need to look at the intent more than anything else, in what context it was said, who it was said by. So I think to ask for them to pre-censorship or to automated censorship, which the current guidelines ask for, and I think that's problematic.
Yeah, because I think with that, what happens is that, any sort of abuse, like we also need to differentiate, I guess, that not all abusive content is really hate speech. And then within hate speech also, what is really sort of going to tip over into criminal or not criminal. Having an automated thing would
won't work.
And I think it misses so many things like sarcasm, like maybe humor. Humor often uses like provocative words and stuff like that. So if you have an automated...
It won't. That's why it'll be overbroad. It'll cover a lot of things. And the other thing that's useful to know, I think enough people, especially I think in some of the Western countries who have been using automated technologies for a while, have done this research, which specifically says if you use automated technologies, a lot of content in regional languages is taken down, which ideally shouldn't be taken down. I think that is again because the learning of the AI in English is very different from this regional language. So I think the language of minorities or regional languages will be disproportionately be affected. And in a country like India, where a lot of these conversations happen in non-English, and I think that number has been growing over the past many years. I think the non-English language content is almost 40% or something now in India. I think that will lead to a lot of over-censorship. And the other thing, I think both Rishab and what Udbhav said, I think the other is the question of giving the power to the intermediaries. So I think apart from what Rishab said, I think at the end of the day, what we should realize that intermediaries are at the end of the private entities. So beyond a point, they don't have much of incentive of protecting an individual's or a few individuals' rights. So I think if a government asks them, or if they have the power to take down content versus not take down content and have a
Avoid
potential
hassle
liability, they would always take that down content. And there have been research in India, in other parts of the world.
They overcompensate.
They overcompensate, yeah. Because at the end of the day, if they take down 4 of our content, it doesn't really matter to them. They have over like almost 1 billion users, but it still affects our like core fundamental rights. And the second thing, just generally, the decision to take down content or not, these are your core constitutional decisions, right? Do we want a private entity to be taking these decisions, or do we want like a court or a entity which is generally trained and which has some legitimacy doing it? So I think those are things.
So there is definitely a big issue of hate speech, and it is, to me, I think it's more problematic online than offline, because okay, 4 people in a drawing room can get together and indulge in a lot of hate speech, but the way it can spread on social media is really scary. So what can we do? I mean, there is a problem. We know that we don't want censorship. We know that we don't want laws that ultimately benefit those who want to censor good ideas. But what do we do about hate speech? Like, how do you tackle this?
So I think that if you sort of look at the core of the issue, everyone agrees that platforms and intermediaries need to do more. That what's happening right now has many areas of improvement, even if we want to keep free speech as sort of the epitome of the thing that we're trying to protect, but still ensure that platforms remain sustainable places, right? So I think that like generally, at least the categorization that we use sometimes is duty of diligence, which is the amount of diligence that platforms need to carry out, while content is being taken onto their platforms, and when content is taken off their platforms, can significantly move the needle on how the problem is being solved, right? So I'll explain that a little more. So duty of diligence when content is coming onto the platform is, when you're taking content onto the platform, how clear are you making it to the entity that is uploading the content onto the platform that they must be careful about the fact that it's content that may or may not be problematic? As a small example, so if you've seen live streams on YouTube recently, live streams on YouTube right above in like the comment section actually say, please don't share any personal information and know that you need to follow the community guidelines when you, for whatever content you're trying to type in below, which is a permanent message that is right above the chat. And the reason it's put there,
so fair warning to users,
right? Which is to say that please be aware of the kind of content that you put up. And there is some evidence actually even in research to showcase that when it comes to, and I know this is both a hate speech as well as a fake news problem, that if you simply just tell users to be a little careful, that there is harm that may occur from content that they are spreading virally without thinking about it, they do tend to think a little bit before actually uploading the content or before actually putting the content up. So that's one part. The second part is being a little more transparent as to how you actually make decisions when it comes to, say, automated filters, when it comes to some of these decisions, right? So again, imagine there's a video being uploaded onto a platform. If that platform is using an artificial intelligence or machine learning based system to detect whether the video is fake news, is hate speech or not, or is, say, whether it's pornography or not, provide a little more information about that algorithm. Make sure that that algorithm is also something that it doesn't have to be publicly available because it may be intellectual property that you want to protect because you've come up with it, but then make sure that it's something that other organizations can review. Make sure that if other organizations have problems with that model, then you can actually engage in a discussion with them in order to make sure that when that conversation is taking place, that you can prove on the fact that the model is getting better and better and not worse. So for example, just merely saying that 80% or 90% of the content is taken down merely showcases that you're good at that. The 90% is something that you've detected, not the fact that whether that 90% was actually content that should have been taken down or not.
Okay.
Providing those data sets, making it more available, allowing research to take place, which is a long-term solution, but that's the only sustainable way to sort of keep those algorithms in check. And then I think there's the stuff that can happen after, right? So when you've taken content down, make sure that your transparency reports have a lot more information in them. You can't just say that you took down 20,000 videos last year. You need to say, you need to categorize them better. You need to give more reasoning for why those videos were taken down. A good example is, if you look at how platforms tend to deal with copyright, Many platforms, when it comes to copyright takedown requests, actually put up the entirety of the request that orders them to take a piece of content down because it violates copyright up on the internet after removing personal identifiers on their transparency report. So if you want to know why a particular video on YouTube was taken down because it violated a copyright, you can actually see a copy of the copyright request, and that's also archived on a separate independent third-party website called lumen.org. That's an incredible amount of transparency. What you're doing is you're actually enabling people to tie takedown with takedown request and the information that is being sent by third parties, right? Compare that to, I think, what happens with hate speech, with fake news, and with many of these other issues. It's much, much lesser. And I think there's a reason for that. It's because platforms are a lot less confident and sure about what information they can actually make available without being questioned for many of these practices. So it's clear that needs to be some closed door conversations, some medium public forum conversations where they actually engage, and then a lot more information generally available to the public so they can be held accountable. And
from a transparency.
From a transparency perspective. And finally, I think there's the question of accountability, right? Where when you do make a mistake, when you have taken down pieces of content that you shouldn't have taken down, there needs to be a mechanism where it doesn't necessarily have to be the government, but the platform does need to have a sense of accountability to its users. Now that can be a multi-stakeholder set of accountability where it can be civil society, government, and other industry people trying to play that role. It can be a self-regulatory form of accountability, and that's how it happens in other fields as well, where there is a board, an industry association that has other members of the industry and independent experts and civil society members that actually says this is okay or this is not okay, and can direct platforms to put pieces of content back up. All of these comes with their own set of problems, but I think on transparency, on accountability, and on making sure that when they take on content and use automated filtering, that they inform people more, are all three things that they can do to help solve the problem.
I'm going to quickly move to fake news. We had this panel in Media Rumble on fake news, and one of the guys on the panel said something very interesting where he said that, what is truth really? And I think that's how a lot of people kind of look at fake news as kind of muddied, because for someone NDTV is fake news, or any news that you don't like is fake news, or for someone else, it's basically become very ideological. Anything that doesn't suit your ideology, you have people throwing in the word fake news. Though I think the clear definition is like deliberate misinformation. There are websites that are just dedicated to putting out stuff which is known to be misleading, and they're doing it on purpose.
How do you differentiate that from government propaganda? So weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or Syria gas attack last year. 1 year later, 6 months later, you discover that these were actually planted stories.
But there's acknowledgement that it was.
I haven't heard a single mainstream media report that the alleged gas attacks.
New York Times. It was
last
too late,
year,
but
Syria. Look at what happened in Syria last year, right? Like where there was that huge apparent attack by Assad on his own population, etc., etc. The world went crazy. Then you had the UN body which was supposed to do that has released a report just recently which talks about how it was a complete scam. And in fact, it was the UN agency itself at the higher levels which hushed up the report, right? And none of this is reported in mainstream media. So if you were to ask someone today, what do you think of Syria? Oh, gas attack kiya tha, he kills his own people, right? So there are multiple ways in which fake narratives can be spread of different types of things. So trying to define what exactly fake news is really, really problematic.
It is problematic, but we do
more
have...
than that, and sorry, one thing, just jumping on what both of you said, and just being very lawyerly here, I am just saying, even if it is fake news or misinformation, I would say our constitution allows you to do that. Yeah. Our constitution protects me to give out wrong information as long as that information does not fall into the 8 categories given in Article 19.2. Article 19.1a allows me to say fake news, to put out misinformation, disinformation. So I think when we talk about fake news, we also, or this word, I think we need to realize that is, as of now, under our Indian constitution, protected speech.
Sure, but it's allowed, and I'm not saying that websites should be pulled down or people should be stopped from,
No, so sorry, just to clarify. So I understand it's a problem, but I'm saying legally it is protected speech.
I get it. And of course, like you said, thin line between fake news, propaganda, misinformation. Sometimes journalists also put out incorrect information. But I think a journalist would usually apologize and pull it back. But there is something which is, as journalists, we know that there are certain facts that you cannot take liberty with. So, for example, if there's fake news being spread about a a child abduction in your locality, which is not true, and then it takes a picture of you and says, this is the child abductor, and then sends that piece out on WhatsApp, and everyone's read it, and then the mob comes for you and kills you. Now this is not a philosophical dichotomy. We know that this is fake. We know that you did not abduct the child. We know your picture was used wrongly, and we know you died as a result of this news that was spread. And there are websites now that are checking this. But there's immense heavy criticism, and I would stand here on the side of the journalists who feel that there's not enough being done by platforms to flag fake news. So why is that, A? And do you think that should even be, like you said,
no, so again, I think fake news has its own problems, and I think especially in a country like India, where especially in the last 2 or 3 years, you have almost 100 million people coming on the internet. And for a lot of these people outside of their immediate community, this is their first interaction with the outside world. So I think fake news or misinformation, disinformation is problematic. The question is, how do we deal with it? So to take the specific example of child abduction, right? Everyone after that was like, oh, there's fake news, let's break encryption and stuff. In India, currently, and a lot of debate is there's no law. Indian Penal Code Section 5051B specifically deals with those questions of child abduction, rumors, what we would call fake news and stuff. So I think first before coming to other part, first let's remove that part where it says do we need law to deal with fake news? We have laws to deal with legitimate. We have laws to deal
with rumor mongering that results in like criminal activities.
Right. So the second thing, what we need, and especially again, it's a question of what we were discussing in the first panel, right? Something like a child abduction. One, you need a lot more proper police implementation on the ground, because it doesn't really help even if you ask WhatsApp to remove encryption. Who do you catch? Like if that fake news has circulated through 500 people, who do you make liable? Only the first person, right? But that doesn't help you with a lot of other fake news. So I think these are the questions that we'll still need to look at. There is a need for platforms and others to do more. But then there's question of what Rishab said. How do you decide what is fake news? Like what do you ask the platforms to regulate?
So on that, actually, I think what some of the platforms have started to do is a good beginning. Again, I think more needs to be done in terms of tying up with fact checkers and so on. And so, for instance, on Facebook, if you guys must have also seen it, that, I mean, you'll get a post which will say, oh, this has been reported by so-and-so as being fake news, so this is not, 100%.
Have they started doing that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that we're not 100% sure this is correct. So there are steps a platform can take like that, or even saying, okay, we've received so many complaints about X piece of content, so don't think about it. But that doesn't necessarily mean the platform itself has to remove the content or act to decide whether it actually is fake news or not, because that is a tough call to make.
To flag it.
Inform users that this might be problematic, inform users that this might be, even for instance, when we were talking about hate speech, one of the features Facebook has introduced is the sort of cover over violent videos and so on, where they say, hey, this might be problematic, do you really want to see it? Right? So there are different sort of steps that one could take. Just saying remove all content at the mere suspicion of, I think, is a little excessive.
Do you think, so we agree on not removing, but do you think flagging is important, like Facebook needs to start, maybe have a different icon of Facebook or Twitter that says that just flags something as fake news more prominently?
I mean, I think it comes with its own set of problems, some fairly serious ones. For example, and this has happened in the United States of America because the program has been active there for longer than here, most fact checkers tend to fall on a particular aspect of the ideological spectrum. And therefore, a lot of the news that's picked out as being fake also falls into the opposite ideological spectrum. And because of that, there's a lot of evidence of, like, say, left news, if fact checkers are left and are pointing out right-wing ideology, that is clearly fake, completely existing right alongside right-wing news that is being tagged as fake. Because at the end of the day, no platform wants to take the responsibility for flagging, and I don't think we should. Like, I don't think.
You don't think so?
I don't think I want them making the decision of whether it's fake news or not, because I don't think it's their ability. They don't have the capability to do so. They don't have the local context to do so, and I wouldn't trust it. Like, I wouldn't trust if they tell me something is fake. I think the approach that they are following of trying to get fact checkers, of trying to get respected and trusted third parties to do it, is a better approach, but that approach comes with its own set of problems. For example, just in India, there are many websites that have applied to become a fact checker, some of which are actually on the right-wing spectrum, that have been denied fact check status, and they've written very publicly about it. And they've said that fact checking and IFCN and the entire sort of system is one that's completely by the left and has been completely co-opted by them. It's very hard. Regardless of whether you agree with that or not, it's sort of true. If you make the list of fact checkers in India, and if you were to see say what the ideological spectrum of the people who actually carry out the fact checking were, it's sitting bait for for opponents to say that that's a problem with fact checking. So I think flagging comes with its own set of problems. Mostly,
but that's probably simply because there is more misinformation being spread by dedicated right-wing websites.
Yeah, so which I think is
and
different.
That's kind of true, right? I mean,
I think that's different from why they are whether there should only be a particular kind of fact checker. So without getting into the question of what kind of news and who's spreading the news, because flagging won't fix that. Flagging will just tell you this piece of news is or is not problematic.
But you still, there's also the psychological element of you still believing what you want to believe in.
Absolutely, right? So which is why I think flagging. So firstly, I think flagging is better than taking content down. So when it comes to fake news, I think content should be flagged. It should not be taken down for reasons of public record. So it exists to prove that this was actually said. And that argument has been made about Donald Trump and Twitter not taking down a lot of things that sometimes he says on Twitter that would otherwise violate their guidelines, and it's openly stated. But also because I think if this information is, but how it's flagged, when it's flagged, is there a redressal? So if I can appeal a content takedown, should I be able to appeal a flag? If I do appeal a flag, who does that decision go to? Does a fact checker take that appeal? Does the platform take the appeal? Is an independent board that takes the appeal? It's a really hard question. I don't think it can be solved very easily, but I think flagging is a decent first step. But at its core, I think fake news and misinformation is a problem of digital literacy and of critical reasoning, right? It's not really one of virality. It's a problem that's this is definitely by far the longest term solution, because the solutions are things that people say countries need to do to enter developed status, have better education, make sure that there's critical reasoning, make sure that there's rule of law, make sure that people are aware about biases at as young age as possible. And there has been evidence in countries like Sweden and in the Scandinavian countries of it really working, because they have among the highest HDIs in the world.
And also smaller population. But you would suggest platforms getting together, a self-regulation sort of a mechanism, or getting together and figuring this out among themselves rather than have a law enforced on them?
I think that the law will do nothing to actually help solve the problem, because no one here is going to criminalize platforms for just letting content happen. So I think the incentives, there should be law that creates good transparency and accountability mechanisms. So something needs to change. I'm not saying there should be complete self-regulation and people can just go about doing what they're doing, but there is, I think, a middle ground that needs to be struck between the law directing them what to do and them having the freedom to do a good job of it. And that needs to be
just
struck.
to take off from that point, so initially when the US enacted their safe harbor provisions in 1996, the idea was essentially to enable platforms to self-regulate completely, right? And therefore you are safe from any sort of prosecution because you are supposed to self-regulate. What we have seen arguably is that complete freedom to self-regulate hasn't worked. So the question is, how do you move up the regulatory pyramid, in order to address the harms, keeping in mind these sort of various interests that you need to balance? That would also indicate that you don't necessarily jump right to the top and say, hum har baat pe danda marenge, or we will do internet shutdown or something. So you take a proportionate or a graded approach, you try and figure out what is the specific harm, try and define that, figure out some evidence for it, and then put in place some measures that move up from the complete self-regulation. So maybe the next step could be, okay, you identify certain types of platforms, say social media platforms, which is actually what the 2018 draft rules were targeting. It's just that they don't ultimately end up doing that. And then you say, okay, you guys sit and talk it over. This is the end result we want to see, or this is the effect we want to see. You figure out how best you can try and achieve that, and we might hold you to some. So take it one step up from self-regulation. Let them still self-regulate, but say, okay, we're going to keep an eye on you while you're doing it.
Okay, this is something you need to take seriously, basically.
So I think solution just that, and I'll probably end on a more pessimistic note.
I think no, there is another aspect which, if I may jump in, Sarvjeet, sorry, but as part of the solutions, I think it's really important, firstly, not to just look at what another country has done and then just copy it. There are lots of bad examples of bad laws also. You can look at what Singapore is doing with fake news, for example. Second is to ensure that our processes are also equally open and transparent. Now, these 2018 draft rules came out in December 2018. There was a comments period, so I'm not going to complain about that. But then no one knows what's happened after that. It's been nearly a year. We've been told that the comments are going to come out. Why can't we see the final draft before they come out? Surely that makes sense. So I think ensuring that even in the process of lawmaking, there is greater participation of stakeholders, that the government is not sort of treating everyone in this ecosystem as an enemy in some ways, or saying, we will suddenly pull something out one day and then you guys had better follow it. That's just not the way you will find an optimal solution.
And I think most of the discussion, as we see from what happened with Arab Spring, where we thought they will change the world, every country will become democratic, to what's been talked. So I think we need to also keep in mind what value this platform brings, how they bring people together, giving access to information and a lot of other stuff to a lot of things. So I think we need to, just remember that, because I think most of the conversation in this space, all of us work on it, and I think it has been very much about what's wrong with these platforms, how bad they are, how to fix this. So,
But I think we can end on what we do definitely want platforms to do is more accountability and transparency. I think that's something that we've agreed on. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, when the public pays, the public is served. When governments and corporations pay, governments and corporations are served. So subscribe to News Laundry, pay to keep news free, and keep a lookout for this series. And don't forget to watch Meghnad's Explainer and our first part of our discussion on content moderation. A lot of what we talked about today will be clearer for you when you watch those two videos. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.